She said she didn't want to be touched the first time Quincy Blackwell saw her. She was sitting alone on the edge of the saloon porch, her rigid posture and hard-set jaw warning everyone to keep their distance. It was 1873 in the dusty town of Weaverville, a growing settlement in the Arizona Territory where the promise of silver had drawn both the desperate and the determined. Quincy wasn't much for towns, preferring the solitude of the open range, but his cattle drive had stopped to resupply before heading north to Colorado. His boots made a hollow sound on the wooden planks as he approached, a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. The woman didn't turn, though he knew she'd heard him coming. "Evening, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mind if I take a seat?" Her eyes, startlingly green against sun-bronzed skin, flashed toward him with undisguised wariness. "Free country," she replied, her voice low and raspy. "But I'll warn you now, I don't want to be touched." Quincy nodded, settling himself a respectable distance away, stretching his long legs out before him. "Wasn't planning on it." The woman's shoulders remained tense, but she didn't leave. For several minutes, they sat in silence, watching the street as the day's heat began to fade. Weaverville was coming alive for the evening miners and cowboys filling the saloons, merchants closing up shops, a stagecoach rolling through trailing dust in its wake. "Name's Quincy Blackwell," he finally said. "I run cattle." She didn't look at him. "Katherine Winters, I don't run anything anymore." The bitterness in her voice caught his attention, but he didn't press. Instead, he pulled out his tobacco pouch and began to roll a cigarette. "Been in Weaverville long, Miss Winters." "Mrs.," she corrected sharply. "And no." Quincy struck a match against the porch rail and lit his cigarette, inhaling deeply. He noticed a fading bruise at the edge of her jawline, partially hidden by a lock of auburn hair that had escaped her severe bun. "Passing through?" he asked. Katherine's fingers tightened around the small handbag in her lap. "Something like that." The saloon doors swung open behind them and raucous laughter spilled out into the evening. Katherine flinched at the sound, her knuckles whitening. Quincy took another drag of his cigarette, watching from the corner of his eye as she regained her composure. "Not fond of noise?" he asked. "Not fond of drunken men," she replied flatly. Quincy nodded slowly. "Can't say I blame you there." A silence fell between them again, more comfortable than the first. The sky darkened to deep purple, stars beginning to wink into existence above the distant mountains. Down the street, a piano played a tinny tune from another saloon. "You have somewhere to stay tonight, Mrs. Winters?" Quincy finally asked. The look she gave him could have frozen water in July. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Blackwell." He held up his hands, cigarette dangling from his lips. "Just asking. Town gets rough after dark. There's a decent boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Peterson 3 doors down. She doesn't tolerate foolishness." Katherine's expression softened a fraction. "I've taken a room there." "Good." Quincy stood, stretching his tall frame. "Well, Mrs. Winters, it's been a pleasure. I hope Weaverville treats you kindly, however long you're staying." He tipped his hat again and turned to leave. "Mr. Blackwell," she called after him, her voice hesitant. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for just sitting." Quincy gave her a small smile. "Sometimes that's all a body needs." As he walked away, heading for the modest hotel where his crew was bunked, he couldn't shake the memory of those green eyes. Filled with a pain, he recognized all too well the look of someone running from something or someone. In his 32 years on the frontier, he'd seen it often enough. Folks didn't end up in places like Weaverville unless they were chasing something or being chased. He wondered which it was for Katherine Winters. The next morning dawned hot and clear, the sun already burning away the night's coolness when Quincy stepped out of the hotel. His foreman, Mick O'Reilly, was seeing to the final supplies they needed, and they'd be heading out by noon. One more quick pass through town to settle any outstanding business, and then back to the trail. He was checking on their horses at the livery when he spotted her again. Katherine was walking briskly down the main street, a small package clutched in her hands. She wore the same practical dress as the night before, faded blue calico that had seen better days, but her hair was neatly pinned up, not a strand out of place. She didn't see him. intent as she was on her destination, and Quincy didn't call out. Something told him Katherine Winters wasn't a woman who welcomed attention. Instead, he watched as she disappeared into the general store. "That's a mighty pretty lady," observed the liveryman, following Quincy's gaze. "Showed up about 3 days ago on the stage from Tucson. Keeps to herself." "Seems the sensible type," Quincy replied noncommittally. The liveryman snorted. "Sensible women are rare as hen's teeth out here." He turned back to brushing down one of Quincy's horses. "Course, she might just be waiting for her husband. Lot of men come out first to set up, then send for their wives." Quincy thought about the bruise on Katherine's face, the way she'd tensed at the sound of men's voices. "Maybe," he said, though he doubted it. He finished his business at the livery and crossed the street toward the general store, telling himself he just needed to purchase a new bandana for the trail. The bell over the door jingled as he entered, and he spotted Katherine immediately, standing at the counter as the shopkeeper wrapped something in brown paper. She glanced up at the sound of the bell, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. She gave him a small nod before turning back to her purchase. Quincy browsed the shelves, selecting a red bandana and a few sticks of peppermint candy. By the time he approached the counter, Katherine was finishing her transaction. "Will that be all, Mrs. Winters?" the shopkeeper asked, handing her a small package. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Billings," she replied, tucking it into her handbag. She turned to leave, nearly colliding with Quincy. He stepped back quickly, giving her space. "Mrs. Winters," he said with a nod. "Mr. Blackwell." She hesitated, then added, "Heading back to your cattle today." He was surprised she'd remembered. "Yes, madam, moving them up to Colorado before winter sets in." She nodded, looking past him to the street outside. "Safe travels, then." "Madam." He stepped aside to let her pass. Katherine paused at the door, her hand on the latch. "Mr. Blackwell?" "Yes, is there? Work in Colorado, for women, I mean." The question seemed to cost her something, a crack in her carefully maintained facade. Quincy considered this. "There's work most anywhere for those willing to do it." Denver's growing fast, boarding houses, laundries, shops, some even hire women as clerks now. Katherine's shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. "Thank you." And then she was gone, the bell jingling in her wake. Quincy placed his items on the counter, watching through the window as Katherine made her way back down the street. There was a purpose to her walk now that hadn't been there before. "She asked you about work?" Mr. Billings inquired, following his gaze. "Asked me the same yesterday." "Seems keen to move on." "Just passing through, I reckon," Quincy replied, handing over payment for his purchases. "Shame," said Billings. "Town could use more ladies of quality, though between you and me," he leaned forward conspiratorially, "I think she might be in some sort of trouble." "No wedding ring, though she calls herself Mrs. Been asking about stage schedules heading north." Quincy pocketed his change. "Isn't it Mrs. Peterson's boarding house motto that a lady's business is her own?" Billings had the grace to look chagrined. "Just making conversation." "Good day, mister." "Billings," Quincy said, tipping his hat as he left the store. Outside, the day had grown hotter, the street dustier. Quincy saw his cattle crew gathering near the hotel, preparing for departure. He should join them, get on the trail before the day wasted away. Yet he found himself looking down the street toward Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, thinking about a woman with guarded green eyes and questions about Colorado. Making a sudden decision, he strode toward the stagecoach office. It took only a few minutes to get the information he needed. The next stage north would leave in 3 days, stopping at several towns before reaching Denver 2 weeks later. The ticket would cost more than a month's wages for most working folk. Quincy thanked the clerk and stepped back into the sunlight, pondering. His crew was waiting, his cattle needed moving, and Colorado was calling. Yet something about Katherine Winters nagged at him, a woman alone, clearly running from something, with limited means and, from the looks of things, few options. It wasn't his concern. He knew that. He had responsibilities, men depending on him, a contract to fulfill. Getting involved in a stranger's troubles was a fool's game, especially out here where most troubles came with gun smoke attached. "Boss," Mick O'Reilly called from down the street. "We're about set to ride." Quincy raised a hand in acknowledgement, turning toward his waiting men. He'd done what he could, pointed her toward Mrs. Peterson's mentioned work in Colorado. Katherine Winters wasn't his responsibility. As he reached the hotel, Mick handed him the reins to his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Buck. Everything squared away. "Just about," Quincy replied, swinging into the saddle. He cast one last look down the street, half expecting to see a flash of faded blue calico, but there was only dust and strangers. "Let's ride," he told his men, turning Buck toward the north trail. "We've got cattle waiting." The crew moved out, a dozen men on horseback, trailing dust as they left Weaverville behind. Quincy rode at the front, his mind already shifting to the challenges ahead: the condition of the herd, the water sources along the route, the weather that might await them in the mountains. By nightfall, they'd reached their temporary camp, where the rest of the outfit watched over nearly 2,000 head of cattle. The familiar sounds of lowing beasts and the smell of the campfire should have been comforting, a return to the life Quincy knew best. Yet as he stretched out under the stars that night, his bedroll spread on the hard ground, he found himself thinking of a porch in Weaverville, and a woman who didn't want to be touched. The next 10 days passed in the rhythm of the cattle drive up before dawn, moving the herd through the increasing elevation, dealing with strays and the occasional ornery steer. The work was demanding but familiar, leaving little time for reflection. By the time they crossed into the Colorado territory, Quincy had almost managed to put Katherine Winters out of his mind. Almost. Then came the accident. They were moving the herd through a narrow pass when a rattlesnake spooked one of the lead steers. The resulting stampede was minor as such things went, but in the chaos, Mick's horse stepped in a prairie dog hole, throwing him hard against a boulder. The crack of bone was audible even over the cattle's noise. "Broken collarbone and 3 ribs," declared Pete, the crew's unofficial medic, after examining Mick. "He needs proper doctoring, boss, and rest." Quincy surveyed the situation grimly. They were 2 days from the nearest town, Silver Creek, and a week from their destination in Denver. The herd couldn't wait, but neither could Mick be left alone in his condition. "I'll take him to Silver Creek," Quincy decided. "Pete, you're in charge until we catch up. Keep the herd moving, slow and steady. We'll rejoin you as soon as Mick's stable." By dawn, they'd fashioned a travois for Mick, and Quincy set out for Silver Creek, pulling his injured foreman behind Buck. The going was slow and painful for Mick, despite the laudanum Pete had administered. Every jolt brought a grimace to the Irishman's weathered face. They reached Silver Creek by nightfall the next day, a growing mining town with a proper doctor. Quincy got Mick settled in the clinic, paid for a week's care in advance, and found himself with an unexpected dilemma. The doctor advised against moving Mick again for at least 10 days, meaning someone would need to stay with him while the herd continued north. "Go on back to the boys," Mick urged through gritted teeth as the doctor wrapped his ribs. "I'll be fine here." Quincy shook his head. "Can't leave you alone in your condition. The buyer in Denver will wait a few extra days." "Boss," Mick's voice was serious despite the pain, "you know as well as I do that those cattle need to get to market. The men can handle the drive, but they need you to handle the sale." Too much money at stake. Quincy knew he was right. The contract in Denver represented the culmination of a year's work, and the negotiations would be delicate. Pete was a good trail boss, but had no experience with the business end of things. "I'll find someone to stay with you," Quincy decided. Then catch up with the herd. Silver Creek was booming with the recent silver strike, its streets crowded with miners, merchants, and the usual assortment of frontier opportunists. Finding trustworthy help would be a challenge, but Quincy had connections in most towns between Texas and Montana. By morning, he'd have something arranged. He stepped out of the doctor's office into the cool evening air, intending to inquire at the local boarding house for recommendations. That's when he saw her. Katherine Winters was descending from the northbound stagecoach, looking travel-worn and weary. Her hair had come partially loose from its pins, and the same blue dress was now dusty from the road. She carried a small carpet bag, her only luggage from the looks of things. Quincy stood frozen in the middle of the boardwalk, watching as she paid the stage driver a few coins to retrieve her bag from the coach's boot. Even at this distance, he could see the fatigue in her movements, the way she swayed slightly as the stagecoach pulled away, leaving her standing alone in a strange town as dusk gathered. Before he could consider the wisdom of it, Quincy was moving toward her. "Mrs. Winters," he called, not wanting to startle her by approaching unannounced. Katherine turned sharply at his voice, eyes widening in recognition and something else, alarm, perhaps, or disbelief. "Mr. Blackwell," she said as he reached her. "What are you doing here?" "My foreman was injured," he explained, stopping a respectful distance away. "Brought him to the doctor. What brings you to Silver Creek? I thought you might be headed to Denver." Katherine glanced around the busy street, clutching her bag tighter. "Change of plans," she said vaguely. "Is there a decent place to stay in this town?" "The Silver Rose boarding house is respectable," Quincy replied. "2 streets over. I was just headed there myself to make some inquiries." Katherine hesitated, clearly torn between accepting his guidance and maintaining her independence. "I could show you the way," Quincy offered. "No obligation beyond that." After a moment, she nodded. "Thank you." They walked in silence through the evening bustle, Quincy shortening his stride to match hers. He noticed she kept a careful distance between them, even when they had to navigate around a group of rowdy miners spilling out of a saloon. The Silver Rose proved to be a tidy 2-story building with lace curtains in the windows. The proprietress, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Holloway, informed Katherine that a single room would cost 75 cents per night, meals included. Quincy saw the subtle tightening around Katherine's mouth at the price steep, but standard for a boomtown. She opened her reticule, counting out coins with careful fingers. "I can stay 2 nights, she told Mrs. Holloway, "until I find work." "As it happens," Mrs. Holloway replied, "I might be in need of help myself. My usual girl left to get married last week. Can you cook and clean?" Hope flickered across Katherine's face. "Yes, madam, I'm a hard worker." "We'll see," Mrs. Holloway said, not unkindly. "Room and board plus $2 a week if you work out." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Katherine accepted gratefully, and Mrs. Holloway handed her a key. "Mr. Blackwell, you said you had inquiries?" The older woman turned to Quincy. He explained his situation with Mick, needing someone reliable to look in on him while Quincy rejoined his cattle drive. "I can recommend Pastor Wilson's wife," Mrs. Holloway suggested. "She often nurses the sick, though her fee won't be cheap, what with the new church roof needed." Quincy thanked her for the information. As he turned to leave, he found Katherine watching him with a speculative expression. "What sort of care does your foreman need?" she asked. "Mostly making sure he stays put and takes his medicine," Quincy replied. "Maybe help with meals." The doctor's handling the medical side of things. Katherine seemed to be calculating something. "And what would you pay for this service?" Quincy raised an eyebrow. $3 a day plus expenses for about a week until he's fit to travel north and rejoin us." "I'll do it," Katherine said decisively. Mrs. Holloway made a disapproving noise. "Mrs. Winters, you've only just arrived, and tending a strange man, it's respectable work," Katherine countered. "At the doctor's office, not some private residence, and I need the money." She turned to Quincy. "When would I start?" Quincy studied her. It was a practical solution. She needed money, he needed help, yet he hesitated. "Mick can be a handful when he's hurting, and it would mean delaying your journey north." "I have my reasons for staying in Silver Creek a while," she replied, a familiar guardedness returning to her expression. $3 a day, Quincy confirmed. "Starting tomorrow morning," relief visibly washed over her. "I'll be there at 8, Mrs. Holloway showed Katherine to her room, leaving Quincy in the parlor. He wondered briefly if he'd made a mistake, entangling himself further with this mysterious woman. But practical considerations won out. Katherine needed work, Mick needed care, and Quincy needed to catch up with his herd. He returned to the doctor's office to inform Mick of the arrangements. The foreman was drowsy from laudanum but coherent enough to raise his eyebrows at the news. "Pretty widow from Weaverville," Mick slurred. "Mighty coincidental, boss. She needed work," Quincy said defensively. "And she's not a widow, at least I don't think so." Mick's eyes were already closing. "Always had a soft spot for strays," he mumbled before drifting off. Quincy frowned, watching his friend sleep. He'd known Mick for 12 years since they'd both been cowpunchers for the Bar T Ranch in Texas. In all that time, Mick had never hesitated to speak his mind, especially when he thought Quincy was making a mistake. Like now, strays, was that what Katherine was, a lost soul in need of rescue? Quincy didn't think so. There was a resilience to her, a stubborn dignity that suggested she'd weather whatever storm had driven her west. She didn't need saving, just a fair chance. At dawn, Quincy was saddling Buck for the journey to rejoin his herd when Katherine arrived at the doctor's office. She wore the same blue dress, but her hair was neatly pinned and she carried a small basket that smelled of fresh bread. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell," she greeted him. "I thought your foreman might appreciate something besides the doctor's fare." "Morning, Mrs. Winters, that's thoughtful of you." Quincy gestured toward the office. "Mick's inside. Doctor says he's to stay in bed today, but knowing him, he'll try to get up anyway. Best thing is to keep him distracted." Katherine nodded. "I've nursed difficult patients before." Something in her tone made Quincy wonder again about her past. "I've left money with the doctor for Mick's care and your payment. Should be back in about a week, depending on how the drive goes." "We'll manage," Katherine assured him. Quincy hesitated, feeling there was more he should say but unsure what. "If you need anything, I won't," she interrupted firmly. "Safe travels, Mr. Blackwell." With that, she entered the doctor's office, leaving Quincy standing beside his horse. He mounted up, tipped his hat to the empty doorway, and rode north, trying to convince himself that the tug he felt toward Silver Creek was just concern for his injured foreman. 5 days later, Quincy had rejoined his herd and guided them to the outskirts of Denver. The cattle were in good condition despite the long drive, and the buyer was pleased with the stock. Negotiations went smoothly, resulting in a price that would keep the ranch solvent for another year and provide a decent bonus for the crew. Business concluded, Quincy found himself with an unexpected decision. The logical move was to begin the journey back to Texas immediately, collecting Mick in Silver Creek along the way. With winter approaching, it made sense to head south quickly. But logic wasn't the only factor at play. "You seem distracted, boss," Pete observed as they shared a celebratory whiskey in a Denver saloon. "Worried about Mick, among other things," Quincy admitted. Pete studied him over the rim of his glass. "Like that lady taking care of him, the one you wouldn't stop talking about on the trail." Quincy frowned. "I mentioned her once or twice. Try a dozen times," Pete countered with a grin. "Mrs. Winters this, Mrs. Winters that. For a woman you barely know, she sure made an impression." Quincy drained his whiskey, uncomfortable with the observation. "She's an interesting character is all. Seems to be running from something." "Aren't we all?" Pete shrugged. "Way I see it, you've got two choices. Head back to Texas and wonder about her for the rest of your days, or detour to Silver Creek and find out what's really going on." It wasn't that simple, Quincy knew. Katherine Winters had made it clear she valued her privacy and independence. She hadn't asked for his help beyond the work he'd offered. Getting involved further would be presumptuous at best, unwelcome at worst. Yet the next morning, Quincy found himself riding ahead of his crew, telling them he'd meet them in Silver Creek after checking on Mick. The knowing looks they exchanged irritated him, but not enough to change his plans. He pushed Buck harder than usual, covering the distance to Silver Creek in 3 days instead of 4. The town was unchanged, still bustling with mining activity, still growing in all directions as silver continued to flow from the surrounding mountains. Quincy headed straight for the doctor's office, expecting to find Mick still confined to bed. Instead, he found the foreman sitting on the front porch, arm in a sling but otherwise looking remarkably improved. "Boss," Mick exclaimed, standing carefully, "didn't expect you for another day or two." "Finished early in Denver," Quincy replied, dismounting. "You're looking better, feel better too. Doc says I can travel by the end of the week, long as we take it slow." Mick grinned. "That Mrs. Winters of yours is a miracle worker. Made sure I took every nasty tonic the doc prescribed, brought decent food, even read to me when I was too sore to move." "She's not my Mrs. Winters," Quincy corrected, tying Buck to the hitching post. "Where is she now?" "Working at the boarding house, I expect." "Said something about afternoon cleaning." Mick's expression grew serious. She's a fine woman, Quincy, been through something rough, though she doesn't talk about it, jumps at loud noises, watches the door like she's expecting trouble. Quincy nodded slowly. I noticed that in Weaverville. Figure it's a husband, Mick asked. She wears no ring but calls herself Mrs. Not Our Business, Quincy reminded him, though he'd wondered the same thing. Mick snorted. Tell that to your face every time her name comes up. Ignoring the comment, Quincy helped Mick back inside, where the doctor confirmed the foreman was healing well and could travel within days. After settling Mick for a rest, Quincy found himself walking toward the Silver Rose boarding house, telling himself he was merely checking on an employee, Mrs. Holloway greeted him in the parlor, her stern face softening slightly at his inquiry. Mrs. Winters is upstairs changing linens, she informed him. She's a good worker, though sometimes I catch her watching the street like she's expecting someone, nervous type. May I speak with her? Quincy asked. Just to settle accounts for my foreman's care, Mrs. Holloway nodded toward the stairs. Second floor, last door on the right. She's fixing up the room for a new boarder. Quincy climbed the stairs, his boots loud against the wooden steps. The upstairs hallway was dim, lit only by a small window at one end. He found the door Mrs. Holloway had indicated and knocked lightly. Come in, called Katherine's voice. He opened the door to find her tucking fresh sheets onto a narrow bed, her back to the door. Her hair was partially down, a thick auburn braid hanging over one shoulder as she worked. Mrs. Holloway, I've almost finished here, she said without turning. Could you bring up more towels when you— She glanced over her shoulder and froze, eyes widening. Mr. Blackwell, Mrs. Winters, he greeted her, remaining in the doorway. I didn't mean to startle you. Katherine straightened, smoothing her apron with nervous hands. You're back early. Is everything all right? Business concluded faster than expected in Denver. Mick says you've taken good care of him. A hint of a smile crossed her face. He's a difficult patient but a good man. The doctor says he'll be fit to travel soon. Quincy nodded. That's partly why I came to find you. I need to settle your payment for the extra days, and he hesitated, suddenly unsure of his next words. Katherine waited, her expression guarded. And to ask about your plans, he finished. Will you stay in Silver Creek? She turned back to the bed, tucking in the corner of the sheet with methodical precision. For now, Mrs. Holloway has offered me steady work, and Silver Creek seems safe enough. The pause before safe was telling. Quincy stepped into the room, keeping a respectful distance. Mrs. Winters, Katherine, if I may, are you in some kind of trouble? Her hands stilled on the bedding. For a long moment, she didn't speak or move. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes held a wariness that cut him to the quick. Why do you ask, Mr. Blackwell? Quincy, please. He removed his hat, holding it before him. And I ask because I've seen that look before in folks running from something, or someone. Katherine's composure cracked slightly, her lower lip trembling before she pressed them firmly together. It's not your concern. It could be, he said quietly, if you wanted it to be. The offer hung between them, unspoken but clear help, protection, perhaps something more. Katherine stared at him, something like longing flickering across her face before she shuddered it away. You're returning to Texas, she said, a statement rather than a question. Eventually, Quincy acknowledged, though I've been thinking it might be time for a change. Colorado's growing, good cattle country in parts. Hope and suspicion warred in her expression. Mr. Blackwell, Quincy, I appreciate your concern, truly, but my troubles are my own to bear. Before he could respond, heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs, followed by Mrs. Holloway's voice speaking to someone. Katherine tensed, moving to the window to peek through the curtains at the street below. Are you expecting someone? Quincy asked, noting her anxiety. No, she whispered. But I'm always watching. She turned back to him, decision crystallizing in her eyes. My husband is looking for me. That's why I left Weaverville when I saw the stagecoach heading north. I thought I saw him in town. Your husband, Quincy repeated carefully. The one who gave you that bruise I saw in Weaverville? Katherine's hand went unconsciously to her jaw, though the mark had long since faded. Among others, she admitted quietly. Kenan has a temper, especially when he drinks. The last time she broke off, swallowing hard. I thought he might kill me, so I ran. Quincy felt a cold anger settle in his chest. Where is he now? I don't know. Last I heard he was in Tucson, but he has friends everywhere, keeps track of stagecoach routes. He'll never stop looking. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He told me once if I ever left, he'd hunt me to the ends of the earth. The footsteps downstairs receded, and Katherine's shoulders relaxed marginally. Quincy fought the urge to move closer, to offer comfort she'd made clear she didn't want. There are ways to disappear, he said instead. Legal ways. Divorce. Katherine gave a bitter laugh. In Arizona territory, a woman divorcing her husband, I'd need to prove extreme cruelty, and even then the courts favor men. Besides, it's not just about legalities. Kenan is possessive. A piece of paper won't stop him. Quincy considered this. Then perhaps distance is the answer. Denver's growing fast, easy to get lost in a city that size. Perhaps, Katherine agreed, though she didn't sound convinced. For now, Silver Creek feels safer, small enough to notice strangers, large enough that I'm not conspicuous. A knock at the door made them both start. Mrs. Holloway poked her head in, eyebrows rising at finding them alone together. Mrs. Winters, when you've finished here, there's a gentleman downstairs asking about stagecoach schedules to Denver. Thought you might help him, seeing as you made the journey recently. Katherine's face drained of color. What does he look like? Mrs. Holloway frowned at the question. Tall fellow, well-dressed, has a mustache, didn't catch his name. Katherine's eyes met Quincy's, wide with fear. How many days growth on the mustache? She asked, her voice remarkably steady despite her obvious terror. Pardon, Mrs. Holloway looked bewildered. Please, Katherine insisted. It's important. I don't know. A few days, perhaps, rather unkempt for such fine clothes. Said he's looking for his wife who might have passed through. Mrs. Holloway's expression shifted from confusion to concern as she observed Katherine's reaction. Mrs. Winters, are you unwell? Quincy stepped forward. Mrs. Holloway, would you mind giving us a moment? Mrs. Winters and I have an urgent matter to discuss. The older woman hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and the genuine fear she now recognized in Katherine's face. Very well, she said finally, but I'll be just downstairs. With a pointed look at both of them, she withdrew, closing the door. As soon as she was gone, Katherine began to move, grabbing a shawl from the back of a chair. I have to leave. Now, Katherine, it's him, she hissed, frantically gathering her few possessions. Kenan always lets his mustache grow when he's traveling. Says it changes his appearance enough to confuse people looking for him. Wait. Quincy caught her arm gently, releasing it immediately when she flinched. Sorry, but listen, running now is dangerous. If it is him downstairs, he'll see you leaving. Katherine froze, the truth of his words sinking in. Oh God, she whispered. I'm trapped. Quincy moved to the window, carefully peering out at the street below. The main entrance to the boarding house was clearly visible. Anyone leaving would be spotted immediately by someone watching from the parlor. Is there a back way out? He asked. Through the kitchen, but it leads to an alley with only one exit back onto the main street, Katherine replied, clutching her shawl like a lifeline. Quincy thought quickly. You need a distraction and a disguise. He glanced around the room, mind racing. Do you trust me, Katherine? She stared at him, fear and desperation warring in her eyes. I don't have much choice, do I? There's always a choice, he said seriously. But I promise you this, I won't let him hurt you again. Something in his tone must have convinced her because she nodded. What's your plan? 20 minutes later, Quincy descended the stairs alone, his hat pulled low. He changed into a spare shirt Katherine had been laundering for one of the boarders too small for his frame but serviceable enough. In the parlor, he found Mrs. Holloway speaking with a well-dressed man whose back was to the stairs. Afternoon, Quincy greeted them, adopting a slight Texas drawl thicker than his usual accent. The man turned, revealing a handsome face marred by cold eyes and a scraggly mustache. Afternoon, he replied curtly before turning back to Mrs. Holloway. As I was saying, my wife is about this tall. He held a hand to shoulder height with reddish-brown hair, likely using the name Katherine Winters. Mrs. Holloway's eyes flickered briefly to Quincy, then back to the stranger. As I told you, sir, I'm not at liberty to discuss my boarders. She's my wife, the man insisted, an edge entering his voice. She's been unwell, confused. I've been searching for weeks. I understand your concern, Mr. Winters, Mrs. Holloway replied, her expression revealing nothing. But my policy stands. The man, Katherine Winters, clenched his jaw, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. Perhaps this might change your policy, he said, reaching into his coat pocket and producing a significant roll of bills. Quincy cleared his throat. Excuse me, madam, but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm headed to the stagecoach office myself. Saw a lady fitting that description boarding the southbound stage not an hour ago. Kennan's attention snapped to Quincy, suspicion and hope warring in his expression. Southbound, you're certain? Quincy shrugged, red-brown hair about so high. Wearing a blue dress, seemed in a mighty hurry. Kennan's eyes narrowed. Did she say where she was headed? Didn't speak to her myself, Quincy replied easily, but heard her ask the driver about connections to California. A calculating look crossed Kennan's face. California, he repeated softly. Of course, her sister lives in San Francisco. He turned back to Mrs. Holloway, forcing a charming smile. I apologize for the intrusion, madam. Thank you for your time. Without another word to Quincy, Kennan strode from the boarding house, purpose in every step. Quincy moved to the window, watching as the man hurried toward the stagecoach office. There is no southbound stage today, Mrs. Holloway observed quietly, coming to stand beside him. No, madam, there isn't, Quincy agreed, but by the time he figures that out, we'll be long gone, Mrs. Holloway raised an eyebrow. We, Mr. Blackwell, Quincy turned to face her directly. Mrs. Winters is in danger from that man. I intend to help her reach safety. The older woman studied him for a long moment. She's upstairs still? No, madam. She slipped out the back while I was providing that distraction. She's waiting at the doctor's office with my foreman. Quincy hesitated, then added, I owe her wages for this week's work and an apology for involving you in this deception. To his surprise, Mrs. Holloway smiled slightly. No apology needed. I've seen enough in my time to recognize a man like that. Evil wears many faces, Mr. Blackwell, but rarely can it hide completely. She moved to a small desk in the corner, removing a few bills from a drawer. Her wages, as you said. And tell her, she paused, considering her words, tell her that sometimes running is the bravest thing a person can do. Quincy accepted the money with a grateful nod. Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. Go quickly, she advised. He won't be fooled for long. Quincy left through the kitchen door as planned, circling around to the livery where Buck was stabled. Within minutes, he was riding toward the doctor's office, formulating plans with each hoofbeat. Katherine was waiting inside with Mick, wearing the foreman's spare shirt and trousers, her hair tucked up under a battered hat. The masculine clothing transformed her appearance remarkably, though nothing could disguise the fear in her eyes when Quincy entered. Did it work? She asked immediately. For now, Quincy confirmed. He's headed to the stagecoach office looking for a southbound stage that doesn't exist, but we need to move quickly. Mick, sitting up in his bed, looked between them with concern. What's the plan, boss? I'm taking Katherine north, Quincy decided. There's a ranch near Denver that owes me a favor remote enough to lie low for a while. You'll follow with the crew when you're able. And then what? Katherine asked, her voice small despite her attempt at bravery. Quincy met her gaze steadily. Then we figure out the next step, together if you'll allow it. A flicker of something hope perhaps crossed her face. Why are you doing this? You barely know me. I know enough, he replied simply. I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you deserve better than living in fear. And I know that sometimes people need help even when they don't want to ask for it. Katherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I can't repay you. I'm not asking for payment. Quincy held out his hand, not to touch her, but as an offer. Partners for as long as you need. After a moment's hesitation, Katherine placed her hand in his the first time she had willingly touched him. Her fingers were cold but steady. Partners, she agreed quietly. They left Silver Creek within the hour, Katherine riding double with Quincy on Buck. The big gelding handled their combined weight easily as they took the northern trail, avoiding the main road to Denver. By nightfall, they were miles away, making camp in a sheltered grove of pine trees. Quincy built a small fire, careful to keep it low and hidden from any passing travelers. Katherine sat on a fallen log, still wearing mixed clothes, watching the flames with a distant expression. "Hungry?" Quincy asked, offering her jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags. She accepted the simple fare with a nod of thanks. "How far to this ranch you mentioned?" 2 days, maybe 3 at this pace." Quincy settled on the ground opposite her, giving her space. "It's owned by an old friend named Jack Thornton. He and his wife run cattle on about 2,000 acres. Good people." Katherine nodded, taking small, careful bites of the jerky. "And they won't mind harboring a fugitive." "You're not a fugitive," Quincy corrected firmly. "You're a woman escaping abuse. There's a difference." "Not to Kenan," she said softly. "To him, I'm property that's been stolen." Quincy's jaw tightened. "You don't belong to anyone, Katherine." She looked up, meeting his gaze across the fire. "For so long, I believed I did, that it was my duty to endure whatever he did because we were married before God." Her voice grew stronger. "But no God I believe in would want this life for any of his children." "No," Quincy agreed, "he wouldn't." They fell silent, the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird the only sounds. After a while, Katherine spoke again, her voice so low Quincy had to lean forward to hear. "We met in Philadelphia," she said. "I was teaching at a girls' school. Kenan was charming, sophisticated, everything a sheltered girl from Connecticut might dream of. He promised adventure in the West, a grand life." A bitter smile twisted her lips. "What a fool I was." "Not a fool," Quincy countered, "just someone who trusted where trust was undeserved." Katherine continued as if she hadn't heard him, lost in painful memories. "The first time he hit me was 3 months after our wedding. We'd reached Arizona territory and I'd commented on the dust ruining my good shoes. He said I was ungrateful, spoiled. When I tried to explain, he struck me so hard I fell." She touched her cheek unconsciously. "He apologized afterward, blamed the stress of travel, promised it would never happen again." "But it did," Quincy said quietly. Katherine nodded, "each time worse than the last. Each time with new promises, new excuses. Eventually, I stopped believing the promises, but by then, we were in Tucson, far from my family, my friends. I had nowhere to go, no money of my own." "How did you finally leave?" Quincy asked. "I'd been secretly saving for months' pennies from household money, a few dollars I earned mending clothes for neighbors when Kenan was away on business. Then, 3 weeks ago, he came home drunk, angrier than I'd ever seen him. He'd lost heavily at cards, accused me of bringing him bad luck." Katherine's voice faltered. "He broke my wrist, said next time it would be my neck." Quincy's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice gentle. "So you ran." "That night," she confirmed. "I had just enough for a stagecoach ticket to Weaverville. I thought it was far enough that he wouldn't think to look there." She shook her head. "I underestimated his determination. And his connections," Quincy added thoughtfully. "He found you quickly, too quickly for coincidence." Katherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking small in the borrowed clothes. "He has friends everywhere, business associates, gambling partners, eyes and ears in every town between Texas and California." Quincy considered this. "Then perhaps we need to go where his connections don't reach. North, maybe, Montana Territory, or even Canada." The suggestion hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that Katherine's flight might not be temporary, that she might need to build an entirely new life, far from everything familiar. "I never thought I'd live like this," she whispered. "Always looking over my shoulder, always afraid." "It won't be forever," Quincy promised, though he knew it might be a promise he couldn't keep. "For now, let's focus on reaching Thornton's ranch. We can plan our next steps from there." Katherine nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Quincy arranged his bedroll for her, insisting she take it while he kept watch for the first part of the night. She didn't argue, further testament to her fatigue. As she settled into the simple bedding, Katherine looked up at Quincy, her expression vulnerable in the firelight. "Why are you really helping me?" "The truth." Quincy considered the question carefully. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I know what it's like to feel trapped. My father was, similar to your husband, not to my mother but to me and my brothers. Used his fists to make his points. I promised myself I'd never be that kind of man and I'd never stand by while someone else was. Catherine's eyes softened with understanding. Thank you, she said simply, before turning on her side, facing away from him. Quincy watched as her breathing gradually deepened and slowed, indicating sleep had claimed her. He added another small branch to the fire, his mind turning over their situation from all angles. Katherine Winters wouldn't give up easily, that much was clear. The man had resources, determination, and apparently no moral qualms about using violence to get what he wanted. Even if they reached Denver safely, even if Katherine could secure a divorce eventually, the threat would remain as long as Kenan lived and breathed. The thought that formed in Quincy's mind then was dark, dangerous, a solution he rejected immediately, despite its simplicity. He was many things, but not a killer. There had to be another way to ensure Katherine's safety. As the night deepened around them, an owl hooted nearby and Buck shifted where he was tethered. Quincy leaned back against a tree trunk, rifle across his knees, keeping watch over a woman who didn't want to be touched but had trusted him with her life. Tomorrow, they would continue north. Tomorrow, they would be one day closer to safety, however temporary. For tonight, that had to be enough. The journey to Thornton's ranch took 3 days, complicated by the need to avoid main roads and towns where Kenan might have contacts. They traveled through rugged country, following game trails and old Indian paths that Quincy knew from previous cattle drives. Katherine proved to be a resilient traveler, never complaining despite the discomfort of riding double and sleeping rough. By the time they crested the final ridge overlooking Thornton's Valley, both were dusty, tired, and desperately in need of a proper meal. The ranch spread below them, a sturdy main house, several outbuildings, and vast pastures dotted with cattle. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, promising warmth and shelter. "It's beautiful," Katherine said, her arms loosely circling Quincy's waist as they sat atop Buck, surveying the scene. "Jack's worked hard for it," Quincy replied. "Started with nothing but 100 acres and 20 head of cattle 15 years ago." They rode down into the valley, following a well-worn track toward the main house. Before they reached the yard, the front door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. He squinted at them for a moment before recognition dawned on his weathered face. "Quincy Blackwell, as I live and breathe," he called, lowering the rifle. "What brings you to these parts without your herd?" Quincy raised a hand in greeting as they approached. "Jack, good to see you, friend. We're in need of your hospitality if you can spare it." Jack Thornton's eyes moved to Katherine, curiosity evident in his expression. "Always room for friends," he replied. "And their companions." They dismounted in the yard, Quincy helping Katherine down before introducing her to Jack as Mrs. Winters, a friend in need of safe haven. To his credit, Jack asked no immediate questions, merely welcomed them inside where his wife, Emma, greeted them warmly. Emma Thornton was a practical woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and capable hands that had built a comfortable home in the wilderness. She took one look at Katherine's borrowed men's clothing and exhausted face and immediately set about organizing hot baths, clean clothes, and a hearty meal. "You'll stay in the guest room," she told Katherine, leading her upstairs. "Take all the time you need to refresh yourself. Dinner won't be for another hour." When the women had gone, Jack turned to Quincy with raised eyebrows. "All right, old friend, what kind of trouble are you bringing to my doorstep?" Quincy sighed, accepting the whiskey Jack offered. "It's a long story." "I've got time," Jack replied, settling into a chair by the fireplace. Quincy told him everything, meeting Katherine in Weaverville, their unexpected reunion in Silver Creek, and Kenan's appearance. Jack listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as the tale unfolded. "So this husband of hers," Jack said when Quincy finished. "He's the type to keep hunting, without question," Quincy confirmed grimly. "The question is how far his reach extends. Denver, certainly, maybe even here." Jack swirled the amber liquid in his glass thoughtfully. "No one comes onto my land without my knowing it," he said finally. "You and Mrs. Winters are safe here for as long as you need, but eventually you'll need a more permanent solution." "I know," Quincy agreed. "I've been thinking on that. Jack prompted. Quincy stared into his whiskey. I'm still thinking. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair, despite Emma's excellent cooking. Katherine appeared downstairs wearing a borrowed dress of Emma's, her damp hair hanging in a simple braid down her back. She looked younger somehow, the strain of travel temporarily erased by hot water and clean clothes. She ate little, though she complimented the food sincerely. Afterward, as Emma cleared the dishes, Jack excused himself to check on a mare about to foal, leaving Quincy and Katherine alone in the cozy dining room. How are you holding up? Quincy asked, studying her across the table. Katherine offered a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Better now that I'm clean. Your friends are very kind. They are, Quincy agreed. And trustworthy. We can stay here while we decide on next steps. Katherine nodded, tracing the wood grain of the table with one finger. I've been thinking about that, about what happens next. She took a deep breath. I need to file for divorce. Quincy nodded slowly. It won't be easy or quick. I know, but it's necessary, a first step toward truly being free. Her fingers stilled on the table. The problem is, I'd need to appear in court. Kenan would know exactly where to find me. There might be a way around that, Quincy said thoughtfully. I know a lawyer in Denver who specializes in unusual cases. He might have suggestions. Hope flickered in Katherine's eyes. You'd help me with that. I told you partners for as long as you need, Quincy reminded her gently. Katherine held his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Thank you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma returned then, offering tea and pie, which they accepted gratefully. The conversation turned to lighter topics: the ranch, the coming winter, Emma's plans for expanding her kitchen garden in the spring. It was almost possible to forget the circumstances that had brought them there, to imagine this was simply a social visit among friends. Later, as they prepared to retire for the night, Katherine paused at the foot of the stairs, turning to Quincy, who stood by the fireplace. Where will you sleep? She asked. Jack's offered me the bunkhouse, Quincy replied. It's comfortable enough. Katherine nodded, seemingly relieved. Good night then, Quincy? Good night, Katherine, he replied softly. Sleep well. She hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then turned and ascended the stairs, disappearing into the guest room. Quincy watched her go, aware of a growing feeling in his chest that he wasn't quite ready to name. The next few days established a routine of sorts. Quincy helped Jack with ranch work during the day, while Katherine assisted Emma with household tasks. In the evenings, they gathered in the main house for meals and conversation. It was a peaceful interlude, but Quincy knew it couldn't last. On the fourth day, a rider arrived from Silver Creek, one of Quincy's cowhands named Tom, bringing news that Mick was recovered enough to travel and the crew was preparing to head south for the winter. He also brought more troubling information. There's a man asking questions all over Silver Creek, Tom reported as they sat in Jack's study. Well-dressed fellow with a mustache, offering good money for information about a woman matching Mrs. Winters' description, traveling with a tall cowboy. Quincy exchanged a grim look with Jack. Has he mentioned names? Tom nodded. Yours, boss, says his name is Katherine Winters, looking for his runaway wife. Some folks in town are talking, especially after he raised the reward to $500. It was a substantial sum, enough to tempt even honest people in a frontier economy where cash was scarce. Quincy cursed under his breath. Did you tell him anything? Jack asked Tom sharply. The cowhand looked offended. Course not, none of the boys did. But he's persistent, and Silver Creek ain't that big. Won't take long before someone remembers you mentioned heading toward Denver. Quincy stood, pacing the small room. We need to move tonight, Jack frowned. Where, if he's offering that kind of reward, word will spread. Denver won't be safe either. What about your lawyer friend? Tom suggested. The one in Denver you mentioned to Mrs. Winters. Could he help? Quincy considered this. Maybe. Thornton Walker is a resourceful man, and he owes me a favor after I helped his son out of a scrape last year. He turned to Jack. Can I borrow your fastest horse? I'll ride to Denver today, speak with Walker, and be back by tomorrow night. Jack nodded. Take midnight. She'll get you there and back quicker than Buck. Quincy thanked him, then hesitated. Don't tell Katherine where I've gone. Just that I'm handling arrangements. I don't want to raise her hopes if Walker can't help. Be careful, Jack warned. If this Winters fellow has put out word about you, Denver might not be safe. I'll keep my head down, Quincy promised. An hour later, he was riding hard for Denver, pushing Jack's sleek black mare at a pace that ate up the miles. His mind raced faster than the horse's hooves, weighing options, considering possibilities. By the time he reached the city, dusk was falling, casting long shadows between the buildings. Denver had grown significantly since Quincy's last visit, the population swelling with miners, railroad workers, and those seeking fortunes in Colorado's booming economy. He made his way to Walker's office, a modest building near the courthouse, hoping the lawyer would still be working despite the late hour. Luck was with him, a lamp still burned in the window. Quincy tied midnight to the hitching post and knocked on the door. After a moment, it opened to reveal a slender man in his 50s, spectacles perched on a prominent nose, sleeves rolled up despite the formality of his waistcoat and tie. "We're closed for the Thornton," Walker began, then stopped, recognition dawning. "Quincy Blackwell, this is unexpected." "Evening, Walker," Quincy greeted him. "Sorry to disturb you so late, but I need legal advice, urgently." Walker hesitated only briefly before stepping back to admit him. "Come in, then. Though I warn you, my rates have increased since you last required my services." Inside, the office was cluttered but orderly, with law books lining the walls and papers stacked neatly on a large desk. Walker cleared a chair for Quincy, then resumed his seat behind the desk. "What sort of trouble are you in now?" the lawyer asked, steepling his fingers. "Not me," Quincy clarified. "A friend, a woman trying to escape an abusive husband." Walker's expression grew serious. "I see, and you're involved because—" "Because she needs help, and I'm in a position to provide it," Quincy replied simply. The lawyer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Tell me everything." Quincy laid out Katherine's situation in detail, her marriage, the abuse, her flight, and Kennan's pursuit. Walker listened attentively, occasionally making notes on a pad before him. "Your friend's predicament is unfortunately common," Walker said when Quincy finished. "And legally complex. Colorado Territory's divorce laws require proof of extreme cruelty, which can be difficult to establish without witnesses or documentation." "She has neither," Quincy admitted, "and appearing in court would expose her to exactly the danger she's fleeing." Walker removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. "There might be another approach. Not divorce, at least not initially, but a legal separation with injunctive relief, essentially, a court order forbidding her husband from approaching or contacting her." "Would that protect her?" Quincy asked skeptically. "On paper, yes. In practice." Walker shrugged. "It depends on the man. Some respect the law enough to comply, others." "Katherine Winters isn't the law-abiding type," Quincy said grimly. Walker replaced his spectacles. "Then we need a two-pronged strategy. Legal protection combined with practical safety measures." He tapped his pen against the desk. "I have a colleague in San Francisco who specializes in these cases. He might be willing to represent Mrs. Winters remotely, filing petitions on her behalf while she remains hidden." "San Francisco is far," Quincy observed. "Exactly," Walker nodded. "Distance is your ally. If Mrs. Winters can establish residence in California, the courts there might be more sympathetic, especially with evidence of her husband's current behavior offering rewards, pursuing her across state lines." Hope stirred in Quincy's chest. "So you're suggesting we head west?" "I'm suggesting Mrs. Winters head west," Walker corrected carefully. "Your involvement complicates matters, Quincy. If her husband can paint this as an elopement rather than an escape from abuse, her legal position weakens considerably." The implication was clear: Katherine would have a better chance legally if Quincy wasn't part of the equation. The realization stung more than he expected. "I promise to help her," he said, an edge entering his voice. Walker held up a placating hand. "And you have, admirably, but at some point helping might mean stepping back." He leaned forward. "Unless there are other considerations I should be aware of." Quincy didn't answer immediately, the question forcing him to confront feelings he'd been avoiding. "She deserves a chance at a new life," he said finally, "whatever form that takes." Walker studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll write to my colleague tonight. In the meantime, keep Mrs. Winters hidden. Once I have a response, we can arrange secure passage to California if that's the route she chooses. Thank you, Quincy said, standing to leave. What do I owe you for this advice? Walker waved away the question. Consider it partial repayment for saving my fool son from that gambling debt. But Quincy, his expression grew serious. Be careful. Men like Katherine Winters don't give up easily, especially when their pride is involved. I'm counting on that, Quincy replied grimly. Walker raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Nothing, Quincy said quickly. Figure of speech. But as he rode back to Thornton's ranch through the darkness, the seed of an idea took root in his mind. Dangerous, possibly illegal, but potentially the only way to ensure Catherine's permanent safety. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the immediate challenge of getting her safely to California. He reached the ranch shortly after dawn, tired but satisfied with the progress made. Jack met him in the yard, taking midnight's reins with a concerned expression. You've got a visitor, Jack said without preamble. Arrived last night after you left. Quincy tensed. Kenan? No, Jack shook his head. Your foreman, Mick, rode in looking like death warmed over. Says he couldn't wait in Silver Creek any longer, not with Winters asking questions and offering money. Relief washed over Quincy. Where is he now? Sleeping in the bunkhouse, but that's not all. Jack lowered his voice. Emma took Katherine into town this morning for supplies. I tried to dissuade them, but Emma insisted they'd be fine if they were quick. Alarm shot through Quincy. When did they leave? About an hour ago. They should be back by noon, Quincy swore, running a hand through his hair. Jack, I need your fastest wagon. If Kenan is offering rewards as far as Denver, he might have men watching the nearby towns. Jack nodded grimly. Already hitched up, but Quincy, they had a good head start, and Emma knows to be careful. It's not Emma I'm worried about, Quincy muttered, already striding toward the barn where Jack kept his wagons. Within minutes, he was driving hard toward the small settlement that served the surrounding ranches, pushing the horses faster than was wise on the rutted road. His mind conjured terrible scenarios: Kenan waiting in town, Katherine spotted by some reward-hungry stranger, a confrontation that could end in violence. The settlement appeared on the horizon, a collection of buildings that barely qualified as a town. Quincy scanned the handful of wagons and horses tied up outside the general store, recognizing Emma's bay team immediately. They were still here, then. He pulled the wagon to a stop, jumping down before it had fully halted. Inside the store, he found Emma examining bolts of cloth, but Katherine was nowhere to be seen. Emma, he called, striding toward her. Where's Katherine? Emma turned, surprise evident on her face. Quincy, we weren't expecting you back until tonight. She glanced around. Katherine stepped out to post a letter. She should be right back. Quincy's heart raced. How long ago? Just a few minutes, Emma replied, concern growing in her expression. What's wrong? Instead of answering, Quincy hurried back outside, scanning the street in both directions. The post office was a small addition to the telegraph office 3 buildings down. He headed there at a run, bursting through the door with enough force to startle the postmaster. Was a woman just in here? Quincy demanded. Auburn hair, wearing a blue dress. The postmaster nodded, pointing toward the back door. Left that way not 2 minutes ago, said she wanted to enjoy the view of the creek before rejoining her friend. Quincy thanked him curtly and exited through the same door, finding himself in a small yard that led to a path down to the creek that ran behind the settlement. He followed it, calling Katherine's name as he went. The path wound through a stand of cottonwoods before opening onto a small clearing by the water. There, Quincy stopped short, his breath catching in his throat. Katherine stood at the creek's edge, her back to him, seemingly lost in thought as she watched the water flow past. The morning sunlight filtered through the branches above, dappling her figure with golden light. For a moment, she looked so peaceful that Quincy hesitated to disturb her. Then she turned, sensing his presence, and her expression shifted from surprise to pleasure to concern in rapid succession. Quincy, what are you doing here? Is something wrong? He approached more slowly, relief making his voice gentler than intended. You shouldn't have come into town, it's not safe, Katherine frowned. Emma said we'd be fine for a quick trip. I needed to post a letter to my sister in Connecticut, letting her know I'm alive. She studied his face. Did something happen in Denver? Not exactly, Quincy hedged, not wanting to alarm her unnecessarily. But Kenan is offering rewards for information. Word spreads fast in these parts. Understanding dawned in Katherine's eyes. You think he might have people watching even this small place? I think we can't take chances, Quincy replied. Come on, let's get back to Emma and head to the ranch. Katherine nodded, falling into step beside him as they retraced the path through the cottonwoods. They walked in silence for a moment before she spoke again. Did you see your lawyer friend? I did, Quincy confirmed. He has some ideas that might help. I'll tell you everything once we're back at the ranch. They emerged from the trees into the yard behind the post office. As they rounded the corner toward the main street, Quincy instinctively placed himself between Katherine and the open road, a precaution that proved prescient when a familiar figure appeared on horseback at the far end of the street. Katherine Winters sat atop a fine black stallion, scanning the settlement with the air of a predator. He hadn't spotted them yet, partially hidden as they were by the building's shadow. Quincy pulled Katherine back around the corner, pressing a finger to his lips in warning. Her face had gone deathly pale, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. Stay here, Quincy whispered. I'll get Emma and the wagon. When I bring it around back, be ready to climb in quickly. Katherine gripped his arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. Don't confront him, Quincy. Please, he's dangerous. I won't, Quincy promised, though part of him yearned to do exactly that. Just stay hidden. He slipped away, using the buildings for cover as he made his way back to the general store. Emma was just emerging, carrying a parcel and looking worried. Quincy, did you find? Katherine's fine, he interrupted in a low voice. But her husband is here. We need to leave immediately without being seen. Emma's eyes widened, but she nodded without question. What do you need me to do? Take your wagon and drive it slowly out of town as if heading home. I'll follow with Jack's wagon, picking up Katherine from behind the post office. If Winters approaches you, act normal, say Katherine decided to stay at the ranch. Be careful, Emma cautioned, handing him her parcel before moving toward her wagon. Quincy waited until Emma had climbed up and begun to drive away, drawing Kenan's attention as he'd hoped. The moment Kenan turned his horse to follow Emma's wagon, Quincy hurried to Jack's wagon and drove it around to the back of the post office. Katherine was waiting where he'd left her, tension evident in every line of her body. She climbed up beside him without a word, and Quincy immediately turned the wagon away from town, taking a less-used track that meandered through pastureland before eventually rejoining the main road to the ranch. Did he see you? Katherine asked once they were well away from the settlement. No, Quincy assured her. He was focused on Emma's wagon. She'll lead him in the wrong direction for a while, then double back when she loses him. Katherine let out a shaky breath. How did he find us so quickly? He's determined, Quincy replied grimly, and he has resources. They drove in silence for several minutes, the urgency of their departure gradually giving way to the realization of how close they'd come to disaster. Katherine's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with strain. I can't keep running forever, she said finally, her voice barely audible over the wagon's creaking wheels. Quincy glanced at her, noting the resolution forming beneath her fear. You won't have to. Walker, your lawyer friend, he had suggestions. Quincy nodded, explaining Walker's proposed strategy of seeking legal protection in California while remaining hidden. Katherine listened attentively, hope and skepticism warring in her expression. It could work, she admitted when he finished, but getting to California safely. Walker is arranging it, Quincy assured her. He has connections with the railroad. You could travel as part of a private party under a different name. Katherine considered this. When? Soon, within days, once Walker confirms the arrangements. Quincy hesitated, then added, he thinks. It would be better if you traveled alone. Katherine's head turned sharply toward him. Alone? Why? Quincy kept his eyes on the road. Legal considerations. If Kenan can claim I lured you away, it weakens your case for separation or divorce. I see, Katherine said softly after a moment. Of course, that makes sense. The rest of the journey passed in silence, each lost in private thoughts. By the time they reached the ranch, Emma had already returned and Jack was waiting anxiously in the yard. "Everyone all right?" he called as they approached. "For now," Quincy replied, helping Katherine down from the wagon. "But we need to be ready to move quickly when word comes from Denver." Inside the house, they found Mick seated at the kitchen table, looking pale but determined as Emma brewed coffee. The foreman stood carefully when they entered, favoring his injured side. "Boss," he greeted Quincy, "Mrs. Winters, glad to see you both safe." "Good to see you up and about, Mick," Quincy replied, clasping his friend's hand, "though you should be resting." "Been resting for weeks," Mick grumbled. "Time to be useful again." He turned to Katherine. "Madam, I want to thank you for your care in Silver Creek. Doc said I healed faster than expected, thanks to you." Katherine managed a small smile. "You were a good patient, eventually." The light-hearted moment was brief, overshadowed by the morning's close call. As they gathered around the table, Jack outlined increased security measures for the ranch men posted at the main approach, horses kept saddled and ready, a signal system to warn of approaching strangers. "We'll be ready if he comes," Jack assured them. "But with luck, he'll follow false trails long enough for Walker's arrangements to be completed." Katherine thanked him with quiet dignity, though Quincy could see the strain taking its toll. When Emma suggested she lie down for a rest, Katherine accepted gratefully, disappearing upstairs with a brief glance at Quincy that he couldn't quite interpret. Once she was gone, Mick leaned forward. "What's the real plan, boss? Surely you're not just sending her off to California alone." Quincy sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That's exactly what I'm doing, Mick. It's her best chance at a fresh start, and you're okay with that?" Mick pressed incredulously. "It doesn't matter if I'm okay with it," Quincy replied sharply. "What matters is Katherine's safety and freedom." Jack and Emma exchanged a knowing look that Quincy pretended not to notice. Mick shook his head but dropped the subject, turning instead to practical matters of the cattle drive and the crew waiting in Denver for instructions. By evening, a tentative peace had settled over the ranch. Katherine rejoined them for dinner, quiet but composed. Afterward, as Emma and Jack retired to their room and Mick headed for the bunkhouse, Quincy found himself alone with Katherine on the porch, much as they had been that first evening in Weaverville. The night was clear, stars spreading across the vast Colorado sky like diamond dust. Neither spoke for a long while, content to share the silence and the beauty of the moment. "I never thanked you properly," Katherine said finally. "For everything you've done." Quincy shook his head. "No thanks needed, nevertheless." She turned to face him, moonlight silvering her features. "You've risked your life, your livelihood, your reputation, all for a stranger." "You're not a stranger anymore, Katherine," Quincy said quietly. Their eyes met, a current of understanding passing between them. Katherine's hand moved slightly toward his on the porch railing, then stopped, uncertainty in the gesture. "If circumstances were different," she began hesitantly. "But they're not," Quincy finished for her gently. "Your freedom has to come first, everything else is secondary." Katherine nodded, a mixture of regret and resolve in her expression. "In California, once everything is settled legally, I'll write, if you want." "I'd like that," Quincy replied, though they both knew such correspondence might never materialize, that the cleanest break might be the kindest for both of them. A comfortable silence fell between them again, the night sounds of the ranch, distant cattle, the creak of windmill, an owl's call creating a peaceful backdrop to their unspoken thoughts. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. Jack appeared at the door, rifle in hand. "Rider coming," he announced tersely. "Fast." Quincy was immediately alert. "Katherine inside. Jack, is the back room ready as we discussed?" Katherine nodded, quickly moving into the house as Jack confirmed the hiding place was prepared. Quincy took position by the window, pistol drawn, as the rider came into view, a lone figure pushing his horse hard. As the rider entered the yard, Quincy relaxed slightly, recognizing one of Walker's clerks from Denver. The young man dismounted hurriedly, leading his lathered horse toward the porch. Mr. Blackwell, he called. Urgent message from Mr. Walker. Quincy opened the door, admitting the clerk into the house where Jack, Emma, and Katherine had gathered in the parlor. What is it? Quincy demanded. The clerk, barely out of his teens, was breathless from his ride. Mr. Walker sends warning. Katherine Winters was in his office this afternoon asking questions about you, offered $1,000 for information on his wife's whereabouts. Katherine gasped softly. Jack cursed under his breath. Did Walker tell him anything? Quincy asked sharply. The clerk shook his head. No, sir, claimed attorney-client privilege, but Mr. Walker believes Winters may have followed him to the railroad office afterward. The arrangements we made for Mrs. Winters' travel to California may be compromised. It was the worst possible news. If Kenan knew about the California plan, Katherine would be walking into a trap. There's more, the clerk continued grimly. Winters wasn't alone. He had 3 men with him, hard cases by the look of them. Mr. Walker believes they may be hired guns. The implications were clear. Kenan was escalating, moving beyond legal means to recover his property. Katherine sank into a chair, her face ashen. What does Walker suggest? Quincy asked, though he was already formulating alternatives in his mind. He's making new arrangements, the clerk replied. A different route under greater secrecy. He'll send word when it's safe. The young man hesitated, then added, but he advised immediate relocation. Mr. Winters seemed unstable, dangerous. Jack stepped forward. We have a line cabin up in the high pasture. Remote, defensible. They could wait there until Walker's new plan is ready. Quincy nodded, decision made. We'll leave at first light. Emma, can you prepare provisions? As the others moved to make preparations, Quincy knelt beside Katherine's chair. We'll get through this, he promised quietly. I won't let him find you. Katherine looked up, her eyes dry but filled with a determination that matched his own. I know, she said simply. We're partners, remember? The line cabin was little more than a one-room structure built of rough-hewn logs, situated in a small clearing surrounded by pine forest. It was basic but solid, with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with preserved food. A small corral adjacent to the cabin could hold their horses, and a stream ran nearby, providing fresh water. Quincy, Katherine, and Mick arrived by mid-afternoon the next day, having taken a circuitous route through the mountains to avoid potential pursuit. Jack had remained at the ranch to maintain normal operations and relay messages from Walker when they came. It's not much, Quincy apologized as they settled in, but it's secure. Katherine surveyed the cabin with practical eyes. It's perfect, hidden, defensible with resources nearby. She smiled slightly. I've learned to appreciate practicality over comfort. They established a routine over the next few days. Mick, still recovering but insistent on being useful, took the morning watch, scanning the approach to the cabin from a vantage point on a nearby ridge. Quincy hunted and checked traps, supplementing their provisions with fresh game. Katherine maintained the cabin, prepared meals, and kept a small garden Emma had started earlier in the season. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, talking or reading from the small collection of books Jack had provided. Sometimes Mick would entertain them with tales from his colorful past, or Quincy would describe the distant places he'd seen on cattle drives. Katherine rarely spoke of her own past, but occasionally shared stories from her teaching days in Philadelphia. On the 5th night, after Mick had retired to his bedroll near the corral, preferring to sleep under the stars, Quincy and Katherine sat by the dying fire, a comfortable silence between them. Do you miss it? Katherine asked suddenly. The open range, the cattle drives. Quincy considered the question. Parts of it, the freedom mainly, watching the sun rise over new country each morning. He prodded the embers with a stick. But I don't miss the loneliness. Katherine's eyes reflected the firelight as she studied him. I always imagined cowboys preferred solitude. Some do, Quincy acknowledged, but there's a difference between choosing to be alone and having aloneness thrust upon you. Yes, Katherine said softly, I understand that distinction all too well. Another silence fell, more intimate than before. Quincy was acutely aware of Catherine's presence across the small table, of the way the firelight caught in her hair, of how her hands moved gracefully as she mended a tear in one of his shirts. "What will you do?" he asked finally. "In California, I mean." Catherine's needle paused. "I'm not sure." "Find work, certainly. Perhaps return to teaching if a school will have me." She resumed her stitching. "Build a life where I answer to no one but myself." "That sounds like a good plan," Quincy said, though the thought of her alone in a strange city troubled him more than he cared to admit. "And you?" Katherine asked, glancing up. "Will you return to Texas after all this?" Quincy shrugged. "That was the original plan. The ranch needs tending, and there's another herd to drive north next spring." He hesitated, then added, "But plans can change." Their eyes met across the table, something unspoken passing between them. Katherine set down her mending, her expression softening. "Quincy," she began hesitantly. "I want you to know," a sharp whistle from outside interrupted her mixed signal for approaching riders. Immediately, Quincy was on his feet, dousing the lamp as Katherine moved to the window. "2 riders," she reported in a whisper, "coming up the main trail." Quincy checked his pistol, then handed Katherine the rifle from above the door. "Take position by the back window. If it's Kenan and if things go wrong, there's a path through the trees that leads to a small cave. Mick knows where." Katherine accepted the rifle with steady hands. "It could be Jack or a message from Walker." "Let's hope so," Quincy replied, though instinct told him otherwise. "Stay out of sight." He slipped outside, moving silently through the shadows until he reached Mick's position near the corral. "Who is it?" he whispered. "Can't tell yet," Mick replied tensely, "but they're moving cautious-like, not the way friends approach." They waited, weapons ready, as the riders drew closer. Moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the clearing and revealing 2 men on horseback, neither of them Jack. "That's him," Mick breathed. "The one on the right matches the description of Winters." Quincy's jaw tightened as he recognized Katherine Winters from their brief encounter in Silver Creek. The other rider was a hard-faced stranger, likely one of the hired guns Walker's clerk had mentioned. "How'd they find us?" Mick wondered. "Doesn't matter now," Quincy replied grimly. "What matters is making sure they don't take Katherine." He glanced at his friend. "Can you circle behind them, cut off their retreat if necessary?" Mick nodded, slipping away through the underbrush with surprising stealth for an injured man. Quincy waited until the riders were halfway across the clearing before stepping out of the shadows, rifle raised. "That's far enough," he called. The riders halted abruptly. Katherine Winters leaned forward in his saddle, peering through the moonlight. "Blackwell," he said, his voice cultured but cold, "I thought I might find you here." "This is private property," Quincy replied evenly. "You're trespassing." Kenan made a dismissive gesture. "A minor concern compared to the theft of my wife." His eyes scanned the cabin behind Quincy. "Where is she?" "Gone," Quincy lied. "Left for California days ago." The other rider shifted, hand moving toward his holster, but Kenan stopped him with a raised hand. "I don't believe you," Kenan said. "My sources say otherwise." "Your sources are mistaken," Quincy replied. "Now turn around and ride out while you still can." A cruel smile curved beneath Kenan's mustache. "Or what? You'll shoot me. That would be murder, Mr. Blackwell. I'm simply a husband searching for his missing wife." "A wife you abused," Quincy countered, anger rising. "A wife you nearly killed." Kenan's expression hardened. "Katherine has always had a flair for the dramatic. Whatever she's told you, I saw the bruises," Quincy interrupted. "I saw her fear. That tells me everything I need to know about you, Winters." For a moment, Kenan's refined facade cracked, revealing something ugly beneath. "She is my wife," he hissed. "Mine by law and by God. No cowboy with delusions of chivalry will change that." "The law can be changed," Quincy replied steadily. "And I doubt God approves of men who beat women." Kenan's companion grew impatient. "Enough talk, Winters. Let's search the cabin and be done with it." "You take one step toward that cabin," Quincy warned, "and neither of you will leave this clearing alive." "Bold words," Kenan sneered, "but you're outnumbered." He gestured behind Quincy. "My associate back there has had you in his sights for the past 5 minutes." Quincy didn't fall for the bluff. "Nice try, now ride out, final warning." Kennan's hand moved suddenly, drawing a small pistol from inside his coat. Before he could aim, a rifle shot cracked from the cabin, the bullet splintering the saddle horn inches from Kennan's hand. His horse reared in panic, nearly unseating him as he struggled to maintain control. Quincy used the distraction to his advantage, closing the distance and yanking Kennan from the saddle. They hit the ground hard, Quincy maintaining his grip on Kennan's wrist to prevent him from using the pistol. The hired gun drew his weapon, but before he could fire, another shot rang out Mick from his position in the trees. The gunman cried out, clutching his shoulder, his pistol falling to the ground. Kennan fought like a cornered animal, his refined demeanor abandoned as he clawed and kicked at Quincy. Despite his apparent softness, he was surprisingly strong, driven by rage and desperation. They rolled in the dirt, trading blows until Quincy managed to pin him, pressing the barrel of his pistol against Kennan's temple. "Give me a reason," Quincy growled. "Just one." "Quincy, don't." Katherine's voice cut through his fury. She stood in the cabin doorway, rifle in hand, her face pale but determined in the moonlight. "He's not worth hanging for," she continued, approaching cautiously. Kennan's struggles ceased as he caught sight of his wife. "Katherine," he said, his voice suddenly honeyed. "Thank God, these men have abducted you, but I've come to take you home." Katherine stopped several paces away, keeping the rifle trained on him. "I left of my own free will, Kennan. I'm never coming back." "Don't be absurd," Kennan replied, as if speaking to a child. "Of course you're coming back, you're my wife." "Not for much longer," Katherine said firmly. "I've filed for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. The papers are already in process." Rage contorted Kennan's handsome features. "You ungrateful whore, after everything I've given you," Quincy struck him hard, cutting off the vile words. "That's enough," he snarled. Mick appeared from the trees, his own pistol trained on the wounded hired gun. "What now, boss?" It was a good question. They couldn't simply let Kennan go. He'd return with more men. Killing him would mean a murder charge, no matter the provocation. They needed a more permanent solution that didn't involve bloodshed. "Tie them up," Quincy decided. "We'll take them to the territorial marshal in Denver." Attempted murder, trespassing, hiring gunmen that should keep Winters occupied for a while. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would buy time for Katherine's divorce petition to proceed, time for her to reach California safely. Kennan seemed to realize this too, his expression calculating despite his precarious position. "You think this ends here?" he asked softly, for Quincy's ears alone as Mick approached with rope. "I have friends, Blackwell, connections. I'll be out within days and then I'll find her again. Always." The cold certainty in his voice sent a chill through Quincy because he recognized the truth in it. Men like Katherine Winters rarely faced real consequences for their actions. His money and influence would likely secure his release quickly, and his obsession with Katherine would only intensify after this humiliation. But there was no better option, at least, no legal one. Quincy hauled Kennan to his feet, securing his hands behind his back while Mick did the same for the hired gun. "Get the horses ready," Quincy told Mick. "We leave for Denver immediately." As Mick led the captives and their mounts to the corral, Quincy turned to Katherine, who stood watching with a complex mixture of emotions on her face. "It won't hold him for long," she said quietly, echoing his own thoughts. "Long enough," Quincy assured her, though he wasn't certain. "Walker will have arrangements made by then. You'll be safely away." Katherine studied him, seeing through the false confidence. "And then what? Looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life, jumping at shadows, changing my name, moving whenever rumors of his inquiries reach me." She shook her head. "That's not freedom, Quincy. That's a different kind of prison." Before he could respond, she turned and walked back to the cabin, her shoulders straight despite the burden she carried. Quincy watched her go, a decision crystallizing in his mind, one he'd been avoiding since Silver Creek. There was, perhaps, another way. Not legal, not moral by conventional standards, but potentially the only path to true freedom for Katherine. The seed of the idea that had taken root during his conversation with Walker now bloomed into a fully formed plan. He would take Kennan and his hired gun to Denver as promised. but they would never reach the marshal's office. The journey to Denver was tense, with Kenan alternating between sullen silence and attempts to sow discord. Katherine rode beside Quincy, her expression resolute despite the strain of proximity to her abuser. Mick brought up the rear, keeping a watchful eye on the hired gun, whose wound had been roughly bandaged but still clearly pained him. They stopped only when necessary, pushing through the night to reach Denver by dawn. As the city came into view, silhouetted against the rising sun, Quincy signaled a halt. "Mick," he said quietly, "take Katherine to Walker's office. He'll have the new arrangements ready." Mick frowned. "What about you?" "I'll deliver our prisoners to the marshal," Quincy replied, not meeting his friend's eyes. Mick's frown deepened, clearly sensing something amiss in Quincy's tone. "Alone, that's not wise, boss." "It's necessary," Quincy insisted. "The fewer people involved, the better." Katherine moved her horse closer, concern etched on her features. "Quincy, what are you planning?" He forced a reassuring smile. "Just ensuring justice is served. Go with Mick. I'll meet you at Walker's office afterward." The lie tasted bitter, but it was kinder than the truth. Katherine searched his face, seeing more than he wished to reveal. "No," she said firmly. "Whatever you're thinking, no, we do this together or not at all." "Katherine, I mean it, Quincy." Her voice was steel beneath silk. "I won't have you sacrificing your principles or your freedom on my account." Kenan laughed, a harsh sound that drew their attention. "How touching," he sneered. "The cowboy and the runaway wife united in righteousness." Katherine ignored him, her eyes fixed on Quincy. "Promise me you'll bring him to the marshal. Promise me you won't do anything you'll regret." The intensity of her gaze made lying impossible. "I promise," Quincy said finally, knowing as he spoke that he would keep his word, regardless of the consequences. Relief flooded Katherine's face. "Thank you." They continued into Denver, drawing curious looks from early risers as they made their way toward the center of town. The marshal's office was located near the courthouse, a sturdy brick building with barred windows and a weathered sign proclaiming territorial law enforcement. As they approached, a figure emerged from a nearby alley. Thornton Walker, looking harried but determined. He took in the situation with a quick glance, hurrying to meet them. "Blackwell," he greeted tensely. "This is unexpected." "Change of plans," Quincy replied, nodding toward their prisoners. "Winters decided to pay us a visit, brought a gunman with him." Walker's eyes widened, moving from Kenan to Katherine and back. "I see. Well, Marshal Davis is inside. He's a fair man, usually." The qualification hung in the air, reminding them all that justice was often shaped by money and influence. Kenan smirked, confidence returning to his posture despite his bound hands. "Shall we proceed?" he suggested silkily. "I'm eager to explain how this cowboy abducted my wife and is now attempting to frame me for crimes I didn't commit." Quincy's hand tightened on his reins, but Katherine's steady presence beside him kept his temper in check. Together, they dismounted, leading their prisoners toward the marshal's office. Inside, they found a surprisingly modern space, clean, well-organized, with wanted posters neatly arranged on one wall and a large desk dominating the room. Behind it sat Marshal Davis, a barrel-chested man with a silver mustache and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darker nature to be easily deceived. "Walker," he acknowledged the lawyer. "What's all this?" Walker quickly introduced everyone, explaining the situation in legal terms that emphasized Kenan's pursuit across territorial lines and his hiring of armed men. Katherine added her testimony about the abuse, showing the still healing scar on her wrist from Kenan's last attack. Throughout, Kenan maintained an expression of aggrieved innocence, while his hired gun remained sullenly silent. When their turn came to speak, Kenan spun a tale of a beloved wife led astray by a manipulative cowboy, her mind poisoned against her devoted husband. "She needs medical attention, Marshal," Kenan insisted, his voice dripping with concern. "She's been unwell, delusional. The doctors in Tucson were treating her when this man," he nodded toward Quincy, "took advantage of her vulnerable state." Marshal Davis listened to both sides without comment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When everyone had finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled before him. Quite a situation, he observed mildly. Mrs. Winters claims abuse and has filed for divorce. Mr. Winters claims his wife is mentally unsound and was essentially kidnapped. Mr. Blackwell claims he was merely helping a woman in danger. His gaze shifted to the hired gun. And you, sir, what's your role in this domestic drama? The gunman shrugged his uninjured shoulder. Just doing a job I was paid for, he muttered. Didn't know it would involve getting shot. Davis nodded as if this confirmed something. Here's what we're going to do, he announced. I'm holding Mr. Winters and his associate for questioning regarding the armed pursuit and trespassing charges. Mrs. Winters will remain in protective custody until a judge can review her divorce petition. He turned to Quincy. Mr. Blackwell, you're free to go, but don't leave Denver until I've taken your formal statement. Kennan surged forward, fury breaking through his civilized veneer. This is outrageous. I demand to see a judge immediately. You'll see one tomorrow, Davis replied calmly. Until then, you'll enjoy our hospitality. He nodded to a deputy who had materialized from a back room. Show Mr. Winters and his friend to their accommodations. As the deputy led the prisoners away, Kennan locked eyes with Katherine, his expression chilling in its intensity. This isn't over, he promised softly. Not by a long shot. When they were gone, Marshal Davis sighed heavily. That one's trouble, he observed. Connected too. Judge Reynolds will likely release him tomorrow, regardless of the evidence. Then what was the point of all this? Quincy demanded. Davis stood, moving to a cabinet where he poured 4 small glasses of whiskey. The point, Mr. Blackwell, was to buy time, 24 hours for Mrs. Winters to disappear legally with the court's implicit blessing. He handed glasses to Katherine, Quincy, and Walker. I've seen too many women in Mrs. Winters' situation. The law fails them more often than not. Katherine accepted the whiskey with surprised gratitude. Thank you, Marshal. But what about Kennan's claims? Won't you be in trouble for releasing me? Davis smiled grimly. I'm placing you in Mr. Walker's custody as your legal representative. Officially, you'll be staying at a boarding house under my deputy's watch. Unofficially, he shrugged. Paperwork gets confused sometimes. The implications were clear. Davis was providing a legal cover for Katherine's escape. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than they had hoped for. The westbound train leaves at midnight, Walker added. I've arranged everything as we discussed. New identification papers, tickets, money. He turned to Katherine. You'll travel as Katherine Bennett, a widow heading to San Francisco to live with relatives. Katherine nodded, the reality of imminent departure settling over her. And the divorce petition, already filed, Walker assured her. My colleague in San Francisco will handle the proceedings. With evidence of Mr. Winters' pursuit and the marshal's testimony about his threats, we have a strong case. It was happening so quickly now, the plans they'd discussed abstractly becoming concrete reality. Katherine would leave tonight, beginning her journey toward a new life, while Quincy would return to Texas, to the ranch, to the life he'd always known. As if reading his thoughts, Katherine turned to him, a question in her eyes that she couldn't voice in front of the others. Quincy gave an almost imperceptible nod. Yes, they would talk alone before she left. Marshal Davis drained his whiskey. I suggest you all get some rest. Tonight will come soon enough. He looked pointedly at Katherine. And Mrs. Winters, stay out of sight until then. I wouldn't put it past your husband to have friends watching the streets. They thanked the marshal and left, Walker leading them to his office where Katherine could remain safely hidden until departure time. Mick excused himself to check on the horses and send a telegram to Jack, updating him on their situation. Alone at last in Walker's private office, Quincy and Katherine faced each other, the weight of imminent separation hanging between them. So, Katherine said softly, California. California, Quincy echoed, suddenly finding words inadequate. Katherine moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the bustling street below. It seems unreal, she admitted. After so long living in fear, to think that tonight I might truly begin to be free. You deserve that freedom, Quincy said. More than anyone I've known. She turned back to him, something vulnerable in her expression. Come with me, she said suddenly. The words hung in the air between them, unexpected and powerful. Quincy stared at her, momentarily speechless. To California. He finally managed. Katherine nodded, a flush rising to her cheeks. I know it's selfish to ask. You have responsibilities, your ranch in Texas, your crew, but she hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. But I've spent years denying what I truly want, Quincy. I won't do that anymore. And what is it you want? Quincy asked, his heart pounding. Katherine met his gaze directly. A chance, with you, to discover what might be possible between two people who respect each other's freedom while choosing to be together. It was everything Quincy had not allowed himself to hope for, offered freely by the woman who had come to mean more to him than he'd been willing to admit even to himself. My ranch, he began, mind racing through practicalities. The herd, I understand if you can't, Katherine said quickly. It was presumptuous of me to ask. No, Quincy interrupted, moving closer but still maintaining the respectful distance he'd always kept. It wasn't presumptuous, just unexpected. He smiled slightly. In a good way, hope flickered in Katherine's eyes. Then, the ranch can be sold, Quincy said, making the decision as he spoke. Mick knows the cattle business as well as I do, better in some ways. He could take over or find a buyer. The more he considered it, the more right it felt. There's good ranching country in California too, I hear. A smile broke across Katherine's face, transforming it with a joy Quincy had never seen there before. Are you saying yes? I'm saying, Quincy replied carefully, that I'd like to see what might be possible too, if you're sure. I've never been more sure of anything, Katherine said softly. They stood there, gazing at each other, a new understanding blooming between them. Quincy longed to close the distance, to take her in his arms, but he remembered her words from that first evening in Weaverville. I don't want to be touched. As if reading his thoughts, Katherine slowly extended her hand, palm up, an invitation, not a demand. Some touches are welcome, she said quietly, when they're offered with respect and accepted by choice. Quincy placed his hand in hers, the simple contact more meaningful than any embrace could have been. Her fingers were warm and steady as they closed around his. Partners, he said, echoing their earlier agreement. Partners, Katherine confirmed, her smile deepening, in whatever comes next. The midnight train whistle pierced the darkness, steam billowing around the platform as passengers hurried to board. Katherine and Quincy stood slightly apart from the crowd, their few possessions packed in borrowed valises. Nearby, Mick, Walker, and Marshall Davis waited to see them off. Last call for the westbound train, the conductor shouted. All aboard for Laramie, Salt Lake City, and points west. Katherine squeezed Quincy's hand, excitement and nervousness mingling in her expression. This is really happening, she whispered. It really is, Quincy agreed, still marveling at the turn his life had taken in just a few short weeks. They said their goodbyes, quickly heartfelt handshakes with Walker and Davis, a long embrace between Quincy and Mick that conveyed everything words could not. The foreman had taken the news of Quincy's departure with surprising equanimity, almost as if he'd expected it. The ranch will be there if you ever want to come back, Mick assured him. Meanwhile, I'll make sure everything runs smooth. I know you will, Quincy replied, grateful beyond measure for his friend's understanding. As they boarded the train, finding their compartment in the second-class car, a commotion arose at the far end of the platform. Quincy tensed, instinctively moving to shield Katherine as he peered through the window. Katherine Winters stood there, disheveled and furious, flanked by two well-dressed men who were clearly lawyers. He scanned the train windows frantically, searching for his wife. How did he get released so soon? Katherine breathed, shrinking back from the window. Money talks, Quincy replied grimly, but he's too late. Indeed, the train was already moving, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. Kennan spotted them just as their car passed him. His face contorted with rage as he lunged toward the train, only to be held back by his companions. The last Quincy saw of him was his figure growing smaller on the platform, still struggling against those restraining him, his fury rendered impotent by distance. Katherine remained tense until Denver was far behind them, the rhythm of the rails gradually soothing her anxiety. Their compartment was small but private, with facing seats that would convert to beds for the night journey. Outside the window, moonlight illuminated the vast Colorado landscape as it rolled past. "You think he'll follow?" Katherine asked finally, voicing the fear that lingered despite their escape. Quincy considered this. "He might try, but the farther west we go, the less influence he'll have. And in California, you'll have legal protection, a new identity, a fresh start." He reached across to take her hand. "We'll be careful, but we won't live in fear." Katherine nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "You're right. I won't give him that power over me anymore." They fell silent, watching the night landscape transform as the train climbed into the mountains. After a while, Katherine spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "When I left Philadelphia with Kenan, I thought I was heading toward adventure and happiness. I never imagined how wrong I could be." She turned from the window to meet Quincy's gaze. "It's strange to be heading west again with another man, another promise of a new life." "The difference," Quincy said gently, "is that this time there are no promises beyond what we choose to create together, no expectations except mutual respect." Katherine's smile was small but genuine. "That's exactly the difference." She hesitated, then added, "In Weaverville, when I said I didn't want to be touched, I meant I didn't want to be controlled, possessed. I didn't want hands on me that saw me as property." "I understood," Quincy assured her. "I know you did," Katherine replied. "That's why I'm here now, because you sat on that porch beside me asking nothing, demanding nothing, just being there." The train rounded a curve, moonlight briefly illuminating her face stronger now, more confident than the wary woman he'd first met. Quincy felt a surge of admiration for her courage, her resilience, her determination to claim her freedom regardless of the cost. "I'm glad I was there," he said simply. Katherine's hand tightened around his. "So am I." The journey west took 7 days, the train stopping at various towns along the route. They switched trains in Salt Lake City, further obscuring their trail as they continued toward California. Each day brought them farther from Kenan's influence, closer to the new life they were cautiously beginning to envision together. They talked more than Quincy had ever talked with another person. About their pasts, their hopes, their beliefs. About the ranch Quincy might establish in California, the teaching position Katherine hoped to find. They spoke of difficult things to her marriage, his father's violence, the scars both visible and invisible that shaped who they had become. And gradually, carefully, they redefined touch between them. A hand on a shoulder. Fingers intertwined while watching the sunset from the observation car. Katherine's head resting against Quincy's shoulder as she dozed during a long afternoon stretch through the Nevada desert. Each contact was offered, accepted, never assumed or demanded. A new language they created together, built on choice and respect. When they finally crossed into California, the landscape transforming from desert to rolling hills and eventually to the dramatic coastline approaching San Francisco, Katherine stood at the window, wonder in her expression. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "So different from anywhere I've been." "A good place for new beginnings," Quincy agreed, standing beside her. The train began to slow as it approached the outskirts of San Francisco. In the distance, they could see the city sprawling along the bay, ships crowding the harbor, buildings climbing the famous hills. A fog was rolling in from the Pacific, softening the edges of the world they were about to enter. "Are you ready?" Quincy asked quietly. Katherine took a deep breath, then turned to him with determination in her eyes. "Yes," she said. "Together." "Together," Quincy echoed, offering his hand. She took it without hesitation, a smile breaking across her face like sunrise after the longest night. And as the train pulled into the station, they stepped forward into their future not as savior and saved, but as equals, partners in whatever lay ahead. 1 year later, a stagecoach wound its way up the coastal road north of San Francisco, carrying passengers to the small but growing town of Mendocino. Among them was a tall man with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to the saddle, and a woman whose auburn hair caught the sunlight as she pointed out features of the dramatic coastline to her companion. Quincy and Katherine Blackwell had been married for 6 months. a quiet ceremony on the cliff behind their small ranch overlooking the Pacific. The divorce from Kenan had been finalized 3 months prior, his attempts to contest it thwarted by the evidence Katherine had gathered and the distance she had placed between them. There had been one frightening moment, 4 months after their arrival in California, when word reached them that Kenan had been seen in San Francisco, asking questions about a woman matching Katherine's description. But the city was large, their new home remote, and their identities carefully guarded. The danger had passed without Kenan ever discovering their whereabouts. Now, as the stagecoach crested a hill, their destination came into view, a picturesque coastal town with a newly constructed schoolhouse prominently situated on its main street. Katherine leaned forward eagerly, her hand finding Quincy's as they glimpsed her future workplace for the first time. "It's perfect," she said, excitement brightening her voice. "Just as Mr. Peterson described in his letter." Quincy smiled, sharing her enthusiasm. "The town's growing fast. They're lucky to have found a teacher with your experience." Katherine had secured the position through Walker's contact in San Francisco, her credentials from Philadelphia impressing the town council despite the unconventional circumstances of her application. She would begin teaching in 2 weeks, once they had settled into the small cottage that came with the position. Their ranch was just 15 miles south, close enough for Quincy to manage while Katherine taught, far enough from town to provide the peace and privacy they both cherished. It was modest compared to his Texas holdings, but the coastal grazing land was rich, and the small herd he'd established was thriving. The stagecoach rolled into town, coming to a stop before the Mendocino Hotel. As they disembarked, several townspeople approached to greet them, having been notified of the new teacher's arrival. Mrs. Blackwell, a portly man with impressive mutton chop whiskers, stepped forward, hand extended. "Elijah Peterson, head of the town council, we're delighted you've arrived safely." Katherine shook his hand warmly. "Thank you for meeting us, Mr. Peterson. This is my husband, Quincy Blackwell." The men exchanged handshakes, and soon they were surrounded by curious, welcoming townspeople. Questions flowed about Katherine's teaching experience, Quincy's ranch, their journey west, their impressions of Mendocino. Through it all, Katherine responded with gracious confidence, so different from the wary, wounded woman Quincy had first met on that porch in Weaverville. Later, after they had been shown to their cottage and left alone to settle in, Katherine stood in the doorway of their new home, looking out at the town spread below and the ocean beyond. Quincy moved to stand beside her, not touching but close enough to feel her presence. "Happy?" he asked simply. Katherine turned to him, joy illuminating her face. "Beyond words," she replied. "A year ago I couldn't have imagined this life, couldn't have believed it was possible." Quincy understood. Their path had been unexpected, difficult at times, but had led them to this moment, this home, this partnership, this freedom to choose each day how they would live and love. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "A housewarming gift." He produced a small box, offering it to her with an uncharacteristic hint of nervousness. Katherine opened it to find a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a key, suspended on a fine chain. "It's beautiful," she said, lifting it carefully. "I thought it fitting," Quincy explained. "A key for our new home, but also—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "A symbol of doors opening rather than closing, of choices rather than constraints." Katherine's eyes glistened with emotion as she understood his meaning. "Will you?" she asked, holding out the necklace. Quincy took it, and Katherine turned, lifting her hair to allow him to fasten the chain around her neck. His fingers brushed her skin as he secured the clasp, a touch freely given, freely received, a physical manifestation of the trust they had built between them. When she turned back to face him, the pendant gleamed against the simple blue of her dress. Without hesitation, Katherine stepped forward into his embrace, her arms circling his waist, her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," she whispered. "For sitting beside me when I needed space. For walking beside me when I found my strength. For standing beside me now as we build this life together." Quincy held her gently, marveling at the journey that had brought them here from a porch in Weaverville to a cottage in Mendocino, from strangers to partners in the truest sense of the word. Always, he promised, the single word containing everything he felt for this remarkable woman who had chosen him. Just as he had chosen her, outside their cottage, the sun began its descent toward the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. The sound of waves breaking against the cliffs below mingled with distant voices from their town now, a community where they would make their mark, forge connections, create memories. Katherine lifted her face to his, a question in her eyes that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with love. Quincy answered without words, lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that held the promise of all their tomorrows free, chosen, cherished. And as darkness fell over Mendocino, a light burned in the cottage on the hill, guiding them home.